sixth installment of American Spirits, wherein we discuss naval power and that uniquely American oracle thereof, Alfred Thayer Mahan. To help us in our explorations, we not only have the veritable George Bagby. How are you doing this evening, sir?
Doing very well. Thank you very much.
We also have Raging Mandrill, the OGC's resident naval expert. How are you doing, Mr. Mandrill?
Excellent, and excited to talk about this absolutely wonderful theorist and an American in the great sense.
Then why don't you tell us about him?
All right. Well, so for those who might be unaware, Alfred Thayer Mahan is a naval officer. He was a captain of the United States Navy and, as was common in those days, promoted to rear admiral after his retirement. Basically, his greatest claim to fame is not any sort of military command or posting he held, but rather in the theory which he wrote down and created, which was influenced by previous military theorists of the Napoleonic period.
Indeed, one of my favorite details about Mahan is he was, shall we say, a rather indifferent ship captain?
Yes. Indifferent might be a strong word, shall we say. But in any case, this is an example of, those who cannot teach, or in this case, write, might be a better phraseology, turn of phrase for that. But he was influenced by the Napoleonic theory and that era, especially people like Hominy. And so with that in mind, he basically created a naval version of Hominy's theories from the Napoleonic era. Now, the first thing that has to be said before we really get into the text is his influence expands far and wide. He essentially created the doctrine of the decisive naval engagement, which is influential on pretty much all naval theory up to the Second World War. And he also had a tendency, because of the technological limitations of his time, and because of his strategic doctrine of decisive warfare and his disdain for commerce war, believed that the decisive arm of naval warfare was going to be the ship of the line, or the battleship base, as it was to become, right? The dreadnought battleship, and I mean. So who did he influence? Well, he influenced the Germans in their thinking on naval strategy. He influenced the Japanese. He certainly influenced the United States in its shipbuilding capability, but also in its general strategy, in both near and abroad, and many, many others. So with that, we can go ahead and get into the text.
All right.
I have a question for you.
Go ahead, Mr. Bagby.
In his, I think it's the preface, he mentions Scipio Africanus and Admiral Wellington as instances of the decisive naval victory that determines the result of a war. Would you describe Mahan as a great man theorist? Is he influenced by Carlyle?
I am unaware if he has any particular influence from Carlyle, but he has a tendency in his writing to draw on historical example rather than logical supposition. And
yes.
That will be 100% clear when you get into the text, right? He loves to use historical examples, and which may not flow particularly logically. He also has a weird tendency to go back and forth and to flow really seamlessly from one historical period to the next. So it was kind of necessary for him to lay out chronologically as a way of ordering the actual text. So
would you call him the great admiral theorist of history?
Perhaps. Although he doesn't really get into personalities so much. He is a strategist first and foremost, I would say, rather than a personal theory of leadership type of person. That's also pretty clear from his writing as well. He believes, just to give a key example from the text, and he's got a chapter actually dedicated to this. He says there are essentially 6 conditions that affect sea power, which are your geography, the physical limits of your territory. In other words, what are the exact shape and boundaries of your shoreline and the oceans that surround them? How big is your territory? How large is your population? He even has a section on the character of an individual peoples and also on the policy of their government, which is very interesting because I found that he was rather even-handed in discussing, the differences between governments. He kind of has a slight disdain for democracy over more monarchical systems, but he does say that in power acquisition terms, it is always better to have a consistency of attitude towards naval construction and the maintenance of naval power. He doesn't like rapid breaks or changes or heel turns when it comes to policy changes. He really criticizes the pre-revolutionary monarchy of France in that regard quite heavily. And he has a more sympathetic view towards the revolutionary government of France simply because and also the Napoleon government, because they maintained a consistency throughout time, whereas the French monarchy really had a tendency to let things slip, and then they would rebuild their forces, and then they would let things slide again, and then they would rebuild. And so there's a sort of historical cycle in the historical analysis of France that he tends to do.
It was interesting to me that in this chapter where he discusses the foundational elements of sea power, he gives no time whatsoever to ships.
Yes, he doesn't really do that particularly. He's not a technologist. Although I think given his earlier section on weather and he talks a lot about sailing ships and the importance of the weather gauge, which is, even in his own time in 1890, this was already very, very dated thinking. The advances of steamships over the course of the next decade or two after he wrote this book would essentially nullify any discussion about his preferred type of ship, which is the sail ship.
He even makes the point that in that brave new era, speed was the new weather gauge, and that decisive advantage would be given to the faster force because it could choose the time and place of battle.
Yes.
I have a technical question for you. I love talking to members of branches of the service, but my knowledge based on my own studies is primarily with the Army. I'm not a veteran. I was never in the service, but could you describe to me the difference between a captain and an admiral? And at what point does an admiral's rank become strategic in its focus? Could you make a comparison? Is a captain of a ship analogous to a colonel or a brigadier general?
Yes, that is correct. It is a direct correlation in pay to a colonel, or I should say a lieutenant colonel as well. So if you are on board a ship in the U.S. Navy these days, you will frequently find that the commanding officer of a destroyer or the XO of a destroyer is going to be somebody who wears a silver leaf on his collar, and the captain of a cruiser or an aircraft carrier or any other larger class of ship is going to wear an eagle on his collar, a silver eagle. Now, the distinction, there's also a slight strangeness with squadrons, because a squadron commander of like a destroyer squadron or a frigate squadron or anything like that is going to be somebody who wears a silver eagle on his collar. He's going to be basically a captain or a colonel in Army terms. Now, an admiral, a one-star rear admiral, is going to command a carrier strike group, basically, or a Marine Expeditionary Force, right? And then once you actually start getting to strategic level, that's when you get 2-star, 3 stars, those are people who command, compact surf fleet or pack fleet or anything like that. So that's a 4-star basically.
The other point to make about Navy ranks in Mahan's time is that the hierarchy was strictly constrained by Congress. I believe at this time the Navy had 4 rear admirals, only 4, and the rear admiral was the highest rank in the United States Navy if you were not Admiral Dewey. Admiral Dewey was by act of Congress given the special rank Admiral of the Navy, but other than that, you went through your entire naval career, you got winnowed out, and the top 4 guys were rear admirals at any time. So as a captain, Mahan is very, very close to the pinnacle of the Navy command structure in this era.
Yes, and as was the tradition, and I mentioned this before, after you retired, you would be promoted post-retirement to the next highest rank. So he was technically retired as a rear admiral. If that means anything to you, it certainly doesn't to me, but that's a more of a posthumous honor, I suppose, rather than an actual rank that you held in service.
So is a rear admiral comparable to a division commander of the infantry?
I probably, yes. I would say, well, maybe a rear admiral upper half. This would be like a 2-star, I would say. So like a 2-star. The ranks between stars and the iconography with the U.S. military are equal, essentially. You're wearing 1-star, 2-star across branches of service. So.
Thank you for that. That's very enlightening for me.
All right. Well, do we want to take these principles in any level of particularity before we move on?
No, we can go ahead and move on, I think.
All right. Where do you want to go?
All right. So I think we should probably start with well, let's start with the commerce rating section. So let's go ahead and jump to page 132. Right. This is a point that's pretty direct to modern relevance, so we'll just go ahead and skip ahead to it.
All right.
Right. So as I mentioned before, Mahan does not like commerce rating, and this will be pretty apparent once we actually start reading the text. So he goes and says, let's see, here we go. There it is. Before going on again with the general course of history of the times, it will be well to consider for a moment the theory which worked so disastrously for England in 1667, that, namely, of maintaining a sea war mainly by preying upon the enemy's commerce. This plan, which involves only the maintenance of a few swift cruisers and can be backed by the spirit of greed in a nation, fitting out privateers without direct expense to the state, possesses the specious attractions which economy always presents. The great injury done to the wealth and prosperity of the enemy is also undeniable. And although to some extent his merchant ships can shelter themselves ignobly under a foreign flag while the war lasts, this guerre de course, as the French call it, this commerce destroying, to use our own phrase, must, if in itself successful, greatly embarrass the foreign government and distress its people. Such a war, however, cannot stand alone. It must be supported, to use the military phrase. Unsubstantial and evanescent in itself, it cannot reach far from its base. That base must be either home ports or else some solid outpost of the national power on the shore or the sea, a distant dependency or a powerful fleet. Failing such support, the cruiser can only dash out hurriedly a short distance from home, and its blows, though painful, cannot be fatal. It was not the policy of 1667, but Cromwell's powerful fleets of ships of the line in 1652 that shut the Dutch merchantmen in their ports and caused the grass to grow in the streets of Amsterdam. When instructed by the suffering of that time, the Dutch kept large fleets afloat through 2 exhausting wars. Though their commerce suffered greatly, they bore up the burden of the strife against England and France united. 40 years later, Louis XIV was driven by exhaustion to the policy adopted by Charles II through parsimony. Then were the days of the great French privateers, Jean Bart, Forbin, Duguay, Turenne, Ducasse, and others. The regular fleets of the French Navy were practically withdrawn from the ocean during the Great War of the Spanish Succession. All right, and then he has a long chapter from a French naval historian, which we can go ahead and skip through. Right, so he also says, the English historian, on the other hand, while admitting how severely the people and commerce of England suffered from the cruisers, bitterly reflecting at times upon the administration, yet refers over and over again to the increasing prosperity of the whole country, and especially of its commercial part. In the preceding war, on the contrary, from 1689 to 1697, when France sent great fleets to sea and disputed the supremacy of the ocean, how different the result. And of course, he has a chapter from the English historian here, which we can go ahead and read. With respect to our trade, it is certain that we suffered infinitely more, not merely than the French, for that was to be expected from the greater number of our merchant ships, but than we ever did in any former war. This proceeded in great measure from the vigilance of the French, who carried on the war in a piratical way. It is of all doubt that, taking all together, our traffic suffered excessively, our merchants were, many of them, ruined. Macaulay says, go ahead.
So he's making the point here, we have two separate historic examples of English naval policy, one in which it adopted a diffuse scare de course attacking French commerce to little effect, and then another example, or several other examples, where the British concentrated their fleet into a line of battle and were, with the support of that fleet, able to much better weather the commerce war. Is that what he's saying here? Yes, basically.
He will get into stipulations and limitations of concentration of force and the, let's say, the contingencies, one might say, that commerce raiding might actually be effective. But
yeah, I mean, the contingencies are the thing here, because of course the English Channel and the Bay of Biscay are pretty confined waters. Is this thesis generally applicable, or is this historically contingent?
No, the thesis is a sound one, but yeah, he does make mention later that the geography of the English Channel is one of the reasons why commerce raiding does work in certain cases, and especially for the English. But that's in a later page. I think that's page 156 when we get into that later. Or maybe it's on 230. But anyway, so he doesn't like commerce raiding for this reason. He thinks that it's generally ineffective because it's not going to actually strike at the center of the enemy's power and mass on the high seas. The point of warfare is to strike at a military objective and to disarm the enemy and destroy his will to fight, right? So given that those are the primary objectives of war, which of course that style of warfare, just to get into the terminology, is called a guerre de scar, to use the French terminology, right? There's a guerre de scar, which is war of annihilation, and there's guerre de course, which is a commerce war.
Of course, a war of annihilation is a pretty German concept, and is become quite characteristic of Western warfare in the last 500 years, but does it follow from that it's necessarily the most effective?
Well, Mahan would not describe it as a war of annihilation. He would use the term decisive battle, right? He would say the purpose is to engage with the entirety of your fleet in one big battle, or two, or maybe possibly three at most big battles, and to outmaneuver and outshoot and engage the enemy on favorable terms and to beat them. That's what his theory basically states, is you have to do all of the maneuvering, 90% of the maneuvering, and then the war is won in a single afternoon, basically. This is the entirety of his thinking in a nutshell.
Yeah. So Mahan, writing this, 20, 30 years before Jutland, when, many people think his theory was put to the ultimate test. What do you make of how that worked out?
I would say it doesn't really. I mean, especially you can see the limitations in the 20th century of his thinking. His thinking is very deeply rooted in 19th century military theory, obviously. And definitely with all of the technological limitations that come along with that, right? So we can go on if you like.
As you like.
Would you say that Mahan is then inflexible or not not so important as a writer because of technological advances? Does his historical approach limit the value of his contribution?
I would say no. And the reason why I say no is because, like many military theorists, he has a tendency, especially in line with somebody like Clausewitz or Hominy, he likes to make up. I shouldn't say make up. He likes to systematize. He's trying to lay out the rules of warfare as he sees them, and he's using historical examples to back up his case.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the best defense that Mahan would have to the charge of being obsolete is the fact he grounds his system fundamentally not in ships, not in navies, not in technology. He grounds it in the geography of the combatants, the population of the combatants, the shape of the coastline, the character of the people, and the character of the government. These are all, whatever else they are, they're not technocratic principles. They are natural principles from which power naturally arises.
Indeed.
These are all long-lasting things. These are things that don't go away.
Correct.
Well, we found out to our cost that they do go away. Mahan makes a great deal of trouble about pointing out that if you want naval strength, you must have commercial strength, and specifically commercial shipping strength. The materials, the manpower, the handicrafts of naval construction, these are all supported not by a naval economy, but by a civilian economy. It's the civilian shipping that builds the industrial might necessary to build naval power. And this is a situation, in my own opinion, that we are confronted with most gravely today. We have barely 100 merchant ships under the American flag, and consequently it takes us 10 years and billions of dollars to build an aircraft carrier because our industrial might has been allowed to atrophy due to the lack of a civilian shipping arm.
Indeed.
We no longer have. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, we no longer have a civilian shipping arm. But yes, I was going to go on to illustrate your point because the next...
Mandrill, how many warships are currently in the U.S. Navy approximately?
Give or take.
Yeah, give or take. I don't need an exact number.
The number fluctuates, but it's below 250, I would say.
Which means it's 2.5 times higher than the number of merchant hulls we currently have, which is a total Mahanian inversion of what the situation should be.
Yes. And we don't even have enough surface ships for what we need, but in any case, we can go on. Macaulay says of this period, during many months of 1693, the English trade with the Mediterranean had been interrupted almost entirely. There was no chance that a merchantman from London or Amsterdam would, if unprotected, reach the Pillars of Hercules without being boarded by a French privateer. And the protection of armed vessels was not easily obtained. Why? Because the vessels of England's navy were occupied watching the French navy, and this diversion of them from the cruisers and privateers constituted the support which a commerce-destroying war must have. A French historian, speaking of the same period in England, says, "The state of the finances was deplorable. Money was scarce, maritime insurance 30%. The Navigation Act was virtually suspended, and the English shipping reduced to the necessity of sailing under Swedish and Danish flags. Half a century later, the French government was again reduced, by long neglect of the navy, to a cruising warfare. With what results? First, the French historian says, from June 1756 to June 1760, French privateers captured from the English more than 2,500 merchantmen. In 1761, though France had not, so to speak, a single ship of the line at sea, and though the English had taken 240 of our privateers, their comrades still took 812 vessels. But, he goes on to say, the prodigious growth of the English shipping explains the number of these prizes. In other words, the suffering involved to England in such numerous captures, which must have caused great individual injury and discontent, did not really prevent the growing prosperity of the state and of the community at large. The English naval historian, speaking of the same period, says, while the commerce of France was nearly destroyed, the trading fleet of England covered the seas. Every year her commerce was increasing. The money which the war carried out was returned by the produce of her industry. 8,000 merchant vessels were employed by the English merchants. And again, summing up the results of the war, after stating the immense amount of specie brought into the kingdom by foreign conquests, he says, "The trade of England increased gradually every year, and such a scene of national prosperity, while waging a long, bloody, and costly war, was never before shown by any people in the world." On the other hand, the historian of the French Navy, speaking of an earlier phase of the same wars, says, "The English fleets, having nothing to resist them, swept the seas. Our privateers and single cruisers, having no fleet to keep down the abundance of their enemies, ran short careers. 20,000 seamen lay in English prisons."
One wonders that there was an oak tree left in Europe.
Indeed. When, on the other hand, in the War of the American Revolution, France resumed the policy of Colbert and of the early reign of Louis XIV, and kept large battle fleets afloat, the same result again followed as in the days of Tourville. For the first time, says the Annual Register, forgetting or ignorant of the experience of 1693, and remembering only the glories of the later wars, English merchant ships were driven to take refuge under foreign flags. Finally, in quitting this part of the subject, it may be remarked that in the island of Martinique, the French had a powerful, distant dependency upon which to base a cruising warfare. And during the 7 Years' War, as afterward during the First Empire, it, with Guadeloupe, was the refuge of numerous privateers. The records of the English Admiralty raised the losses of the English in the West Indies during the first years of the 7 Years' War to 1,400 merchantmen taken or destroyed. The English fleet was therefore directed against the islands, both of which fell, involving a loss to the trade of France greater than all the depredations of her cruisers on the English commerce, besides breaking up the system. But in the War of 1778, the great fleets protected the islands, which were not even threatened at any time. And of course, he goes on to say, "So far as we have been viewing the effect of a purely cruising warfare, not based upon powerful squadrons, only upon that particular part of the enemy's strength against which it is theoretically directed, upon his commerce and general wealth, upon the sinews of war. The evidence seems to show that even for its own special ends, such a mode of war is inconclusive, worrying, but not deadly. It might almost be said that it causes needless suffering. What, however, is the effect of this policy upon the general ends of the war, to which it is one of the means and to which it is subsidiary? How, again, does it react upon the people that practice it? As the historical evidences will come up in detail from time to time, it need here only be summarized. The result to England in the days of Charles II has been seen, her coast insulted, her shipping burned almost within sight of her capital. In the War of the Spanish Succession, when the control of Spain was the military object, while the French depended upon a cruising war against commerce, the navies of England and Holland, unopposed, guarded the coasts of the peninsula, blocked the port of Toulon, and forced the French succors to cross the Pyrenees, and by keeping open the sea highway, neutralized the geographical nearness of France to the seat of war. Their fleets seized Gibraltar, Barcelona, and Minorca, and cooperating with the Austrian army, failed by little of reducing Toulon. In the 7 Years' War, the English fleets seized or aided in seizing all the most valuable colonies of France and Spain, and made frequent descents on the French coast. The War of the American Revolution affords no lesson, the fleets being nearly equal. The next most striking instance to Americans is the War of 1812. Everybody knows how our privateers swarmed over the seas, and that from the smallness of our navy, the war was essentially, indeed solely, a cruising war. Except upon the lakes, it is doubtful if more than 2 ships at any time acted together. The injury done to English commerce, thus unexpectedly attacked by a distant foe which had been undervalued, may be fully concluded. But on the one hand, the American cruisers were powerfully supported by the French fleet, which, being assembled in larger or smaller bodies in the many ports under the Emperor's control, from Antwerp to Venice, tied the fleets of England to blockade duty. And on the other hand, when the fall of the Emperor released them, our coasts were insulted in every direction, the Chesapeake entered and controlled, its shores wasted, the Potomac ascended, and Washington burned. The northern frontier was kept in a state of alarm, though their squadrons, absolutely weak but relatively strong, sustained the general defense, while in the south, the Mississippi was entered unopposed and New Orleans barely saved. When negotiations for peace were opened, the bearing of the English toward the American envoys was not that of men who felt their country to be threatened with an unbearable evil. The late Civil War, with the cruises of the Alabama and Sumter and their escorts, revived the tradition of commerce destroying. Insofar as this is one means to a general end, and is based upon a navy otherwise powerful, it is well. But we need not expect to see the feats of those ships repeated in the face of a great sea power. In the first place, those cruises were powerfully supported by the determination of the United States to blockade not only the chief centers of southern trade, but every inlet of the coast, thus leaving few ships available for pursuit. In the second place, had there been 10 of those cruisers where there was one, they would not have stopped the incursion in southern waters of the Union fleet, which penetrated to every point accessible from the sea. And in the third place, the undeniable injury, direct and indirect, inflicted upon individuals and upon one branch of the nation's industry. And how high that shipping industry stands in the writer's estimation need not be repeated. Did not in the least influence or retard the event of the war. Apologies, this is the last page in this section. He goes on and on and on and on, but you get the picture.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, he seems to be drawing the point that the existence of a fleet in being will force the opponent to concentrate his forces, which in turn leaves both sides with less resources to diffuse and go after commerce.
Indeed, that seems to be the point that he's generally getting toward.
So the example he makes of the Civil War is very interesting because, of course, the great battles of the rivers and the siege of Vicksburg and the control of the American network of inland waterways was, an intensely naval, or at least brown water naval conflict for which the South was very unprepared by nature of its geography and the character of its people to deleterious effect, Mahan tells us.
Indeed, he does make mention of this, and I think it would also not be amiss to say that he would chide us for our continued unwillingness to fortify the Mississippi in any meaningful sense.
Well, historically, it's been a tremendous challenge because the low-lying land at the mouth of the Mississippi has made it extremely difficult to build adequate fortifications. And we saw this in the Civil War with Farragut's innovative approach to the forts guarding New Orleans, Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip, both about 100 miles away from New Orleans proper, by way of the river, which winds around down there. Both of them were so low they could not they couldn't shoot very far away. They didn't have much of a view of the area, and this is really an insurmountable challenge. The only, well, I suppose with modern artillery, of course that's not at all a concern now, but if the Confederates had modern rifles down there and mortars of an exceptionally high caliber, they would have been able to hold off Farragut. What Farragut did down in the Mississippi was he mounted siege mortars on ocean-going schooners, and this enabled him to shoot around a bend in the river and bombard those forts. And that was the key to his success. After bombarding the forts for some days, he ran the gauntlet of the forts. The Confederacy, for all of their inadequacy in shipbuilding, did do extraordinary things to try to field a brownwater navy on the Mississippi. They laid down 2 large ironclads in New Orleans and 2 more in Memphis. Of the 4 they laid down, 2 actually took to the sea. The Louisiana, down in New Orleans, which is a bizarre craft. It had 2 paddle wheels mounted amidships and 2 screw propulsion systems. So it had a divided hull amidships. It had a single bow. It was not a catamaran. But when it was launched, when Farragut took positions down at Fort Jackson, only the paddle wheelers were operational. It had 2 paddles in tandem under an armored covering amidships.
So the
And it
paddles
had
were
2
mounted
screw
in the center
propellers.
line in the middle of the ship?
Yes.
Oh,
It was a
interesting.
bizarre craft, a very strange craft. And it was repurposed for use as an ironclad. And they actually added the screw propulsion after the keel had been laid.
Huh.
And the screw propellers were never operational. They took it out into the river for trials, and they found the vessel couldn't be maneuvered. It couldn't make headway against the river's current. It was so weak in propulsion. And though they had mechanics on board 24 hours a day trying to bring the screw propellers online, they were never functional. And Farragut bypassed the forts, and the Louisiana was scuttled. The case of the ironclads at Memphis is slightly different. The Arkansas was salvaged from the fall of Memphis in April of '62 and was taken into the interior of Mississippi, where it was completed. Against all odds, they did it in Mississippi, where they had no industry to support the ship's construction. They managed to machine parts for the engines in the backwoods of Mississippi and launched the Arkansas. So the Arkansas had a very brief career, but it was plagued with mechanical problems. It did alarm Farragut for a time. They did try to field capital ships against the Union Navy, but it was such a tremendous challenge for them. The Union produced 7 ironclads in St. Louis in only a few months. It was a really extraordinary industrial capacity up there at Carondelet in the St. Louis area. And they built a whole fleet of riverine ironclads in the time the Confederacy just managed to produce 2, only one of which was functional. So all that to say, it wasn't for lack of industry or even remarkable ability. They just simply did not have the shipyards to match the Union's production, at least in the Mississippi Valley. They certainly never had the chance over at the Gosport Naval Yard in Norfolk, where they only fielded a single ship, the Virginia.
Which touches upon 2 of the Mahanian points. First, the population size of the South was, of course, much smaller and sparser than was the North, and at least in Mahan's recounting of it, the character of the Southern people is much less sea-oriented than was that of the North.
There is no question about that, and he is absolutely right on the subject. Southerners did not build ships. It was a very unusual thing that New Orleans had a complete shipyard. The only reason why there was a well-equipped shipyard in Virginia is because the United States Navy built it. It was not a Virginian occupation, and Southerners did not crowd into cities and workshops. They were not mechanically oriented. It's one of the remarkable things about the Southern War effort that they were able to speed run mechanics. And they did extraordinary things in spite of these limitations. They did field the Hunley in Charleston, the first military submarine. They did have really incredible engineering successes during the war, but this was not their preoccupation. They all wanted to be farmers. They did not live in cities. They did not. The war began. The sole well-equipped ironworks in the South, the Tredegar Ironworks in Richmond, was the product of capital investment. But when it came to actually employing people there, the investors of the Tredegar work went all the way to Boston and relocated their labor force to Richmond because they could not hire Southerners to work in a steelworks. They did not want to do that. That was not their vision of a good life. So Mahan's observation that the character of the people is dependent, or the character of the people determines the ability in naval strategy, is spot on. He is absolutely right in this.
Shall we continue, Mandrill?
Sure. I don't think for the next page we have to read the text verbatim here, but it is interesting because continuing our point of the Civil War, Mahan is, you can pretty clearly see on the page, he makes the comparison of the North as England and the South as France. And given our earlier discussion on those two nations, I think it's fascinating that he discusses this point, and I would just be very interested to hear Mr. Bagby's opinion on that comparison.
It's a very interesting one. The focus on commerce rating, that was really the only option left for the South in naval strategy in the Civil War. Pardon me. So they had fleet-footed vessels. These were outfitted to be commercial ships. They were armed, and Mahan does note that it does not take much armament to outfit a commerce raider. You can outfit a merchantman for the purpose. It just needs to be a lightweight ship in order to catch up with a merchant vessel and subdue it. This was the career of several celebrated CSA commerce raiders, the Shenandoah, the Florida, the Sumter, the Alabama being perhaps the most famous of all of them, Admiral Sims commerce raider. They initially outfitted Southern-owned ships, and this is an important point because the South owned very few ships. This was not their vision of what they wanted to do with their lives. Southerners were quite averse to merchant activities. This is a very remarkable and durable character in the South. To this day, you go to places like rural Mississippi, with very small towns and the like. The mercantiles have European names and Jewish names historically. Now they're all chain stores. Obviously, now they're all going to Dollar General and such. But through the decades following the war, this is an extraordinary thing. I had conversations with folks about this recently. I visited an Orthodox church in Vicksburg, Mississippi, and I was talking to the Lebanese Christians there who have a strange mixture of Arabic accents and old Mississippi Southern accents, because most of them have been there for a long time, so they've acclimated. But they tell me that back in the decades following the Civil War, the only merchants in the city were Italians, Lebanese, and Jews. Those are the only people engaged in trade. And this is such a durable characteristic. You can go to very remote areas in Mississippi and Alabama, and you will find a little abandoned Jewish synagogue. Because in the decades following the war, as these market towns grew and railroad networks developed and such, the only people that were willing to open a mercantile and sell groceries or sell clothing were foreign immigrants to the area, recent arrivals, because the Anglo-Americans, the Southerners in the area, did not want to participate in merchant trade. So this was a characteristic in the maritime sphere, because Southerners did not build ships, did not work as sailors, even after the War of 1812, where we see a major investment in the United States Navy. There is a big naval building program in the decades following the War of 1812, mostly for coastal defense, not for force projection. The
famous
Americans
story of
were
the SS United States comes to mind. We built these beautiful ships of the line. We finished them 80%, and then we mothballed them and never used them.
Yes. And it was because of the enduring expense of maintenance. Once you put a ship on the water and you staff the ship, navies are very expensive propositions, and they must be maintained for a long time. So the strict budgets of the early American Republic limited that. They wanted instead coastal defense fleets, and they made their most prominent investment in coastal fortifications. That was the largest single investment for national defense in our early history. But in the South, when the Navy is coming online in the Monroe and Adams administrations that followed the War of 1812, it is the North that is most interested in supplying sailors and maritime expertise officers for the Navy. Now, this is not to say the South made no contributions there. We have the remarkable career of Matthew Fontaine Maury, who is a world-renowned scientist and the first superintendent of the Naval Academy at West Point. He was from the inland mountains of Virginia, and he earned his sobriquet Pathfinder of the Seas. He once had a lovely monument in Richmond, Virginia, before it was disgracefully torn down. But he was a world-renowned scientist and administrator of the Naval Academy. He sided with Virginia in the war and became the master of a non-existent navy, primarily made of commerce raiders. So he didn't really have that much to do. So the South did have talent. They did not send their sons to sea. They did not aspire to be sailors. And this does correspond with the environment. Mahan talks a lot about the physical geography of a place and the determination it makes in its naval expertise. And this was certainly an example in American history. The South was a verdant, temperate zone. It offered high profits to dedicated farmers willing to raise cash crops or livestock. The North presents a very different geography, and this is a very important feature. And this has to do with the development of the different interests of the sections of the Union, because the North has long winters, it has a rocky climate, it is not well disposed for farming, it has a short growing season, and this meant that the people that settle in the North look for other advantages and opportunities. They make mills and they start building things year-round in industrial occupations. They go to sea, and they did this very early. They sent their sons as sailors to sea. They have large naval stores, large old growth forests, and shipyards become a thing in New England even back in colonial days. People start investing their money in collective initiatives. They form stock corporations. They build ships with their resources, and they send them abroad for wealth. And this was a long concern in the New England section and the northern states, Pennsylvania, New York. They send large numbers of their sons to sea as sailors. They invest in ships. They develop a maritime trade. There's a very interesting book on this. Yes. Samuel Eliot Morison, the admiral of the admiral historian, wrote a book called The Maritime History of Massachusetts, which is a wonderful resource on that subject.
So these sons of Plymouth got back on the ships. The sons of Jamestown went inland and never looked back.
Absolutely, that was the case.
Right. Well, there's only one more small section on this page that I want to cover, and you'll see immediately why once we get into it. So the overbear, he's goes on to say about why commerce rating is not viable and why a guerre d'escars is always superior. But he says, this overbearing power can only be exercised by great navies and by them on the broad sea less efficiently now than in the days when the neutral flag had not its present immunity. It is not unlikely that, in the event of a war between maritime nations, an attempt may be made by the one having a great sea power and wishing to break down its enemy commerce, to interpret the phrase effective blockade in the manner that best suits its interests at the time, to assert that the speed and disposal of its ships make the blockade effective at much greater distances and with fewer ships than formerly. The determination of such a question will depend not upon the weaker belligerent, but upon neutral powers. It will raise the issue between belligerent and neutral rights. And if the belligerent have a vastly overpowering navy, he may carry his point, just as England, when possessing the mastery of the seas, long refused to admit the doctrine of the neutral flag covering the goods.
Which is, of course, exactly what would happen in 1914. The British would declare a blockade and stop all neutral shipping from coming to the Central Powers within their ability to do so, much to the protestation of the Central Powers, the retaliation with the submarine campaign, and ultimately the enragement of the neutral United States to bring it into the war.
Tell me, Mandrill, what is the impact of modern technological advances such as hypersonic missiles and drones in relation to this? So does this make modern navies obsolete?
By no means. So this gets into my own personal theories and description on the weapons triangle that has existed in naval terms for a very long period of time. In army terms, the weapons triangle goes, to use the Napoleonic descriptor, you have cavalry, artillery, and foot as the three arms of warfare. Now, of course, there's the additional element of air power, which is kind of a combination of cavalry and artillery. You might describe this as a horse archer in classical terms, which is a nigh unbeatable form of warfare. He who has the air power usually wins in terms of at least American military doctrine thinking. But in naval terms, the same weapons triangle basically exists and has for at least 100 years now. You have surface vessels as, in my thinking, the infantry. You have submarines as a slow-moving artillery form, and then you have obviously air power as or carrier-based fleet warfare as a sort of cavalry element, if you want to put it in those terms, as a roughly not quite one-to-one analogy. So because of this warfare triangle, drones do have an outsized impact on naval warfare. And there's a very crucial reason for this, and that is warship survivability and mission kill. The concept of mission kill is not I sink your warship, but I manage to land one single missile strike on the crucial radar system that your warship is using to defend against air and missile attacks. And that therefore takes out the purpose of your warship, and so your warship is no longer combat effective in any meaningful sense. It's the same thing with the carrier warfare. You don't need to sink a carrier necessarily, you just need to set the flight deck on fire and punch holes in it so it can't launch or recover aircraft. Then it's useless for its intended purpose at war. Now, that being said, drones are an incredible power balancing element, because you can fly a extremely cheap drone. It will suicide bomb itself on a fixed radar array of a let's just say a DDG of some kind, or a frigate, those are pretty common warships, and everybody has an analogy or one of those in their service. And you basically can use a cheap drone to attack a $2.3 billion warfare asset and to knock it out, or to make it so that it cannot do its purpose to full effectiveness, right? And if you have many of these cheap drones, and you're firing a $1.3 to $1.5 million SM-2 missile at a drone to knock it out of the sky to prevent it from hitting your warship, well, who is got the best design to cost? And the answer is the drone. And drones do not need to be necessarily long range if you are a nation with a very close in strait. You only need to have enough ammunition, which that's exactly what a drone is. It is just simply a bullet. It is a missile. It is an expendable resource like any other missile or bullet. And if you have enough ammo, you can fire at people until they run out of defenses. And if inevitably you get a hit with either a drone or a better piece of ammo.
And so how does that translate to not obsoleting navies?
It means that you have to build it as if it's going to get broken. So the era of warfare gigantism is basically over. The days of the supercarrier probably are going to be behind us. I think that what you will see is a reversion to World War II size carriers. And I think that you're already beginning to see a lot of the other navies like China, like Russia, they're already downsizing a lot of their surface vessels and focusing on frigates. That's already in keeping with Russia's tactical and strategic doctrines for what they do with their fleet. But it just goes to show you that everybody is beginning to downsize and to make ships that are increasingly smaller. That doesn't mean to say that they won't have the ability to shoot down enemy warplanes, or that they won't have the ability to destroy submarines, right? They're still going to be required to defend themselves against whatever type of asset that's being employed against them, but they're just going to be a lot smaller, and they're going to be built more of them. You're going to have to build a bigger fleet, basically, with a lot smaller ships.
I had occasion a month ago to drive from Chicago to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And as I did so, I passed through Manitowoc, Wisconsin. And as I went over the bridge, I saw moored there the 2 Constellation-class frigates that the Navy just built at immense expense. I believe they may originally planned to build dozens of them, but canceled the program after only 2. Is the United States structurally capable of making this transition within its defense complex?
Well, I mean, that also has to do with the personality of the great man who is leading us. Unfortunately, it seems that the current administration wants to focus on battleships, which from Mahan's perspective is totally and 100% valid. There is, let's put it this way, a modern destroyer is, in rough dimensions, the same size as a battleship of 100 years ago. It's about 500 feet long. It's roughly around 10,000 tons in terms of its total tonnage. You might have arguments about the total, size, breadth of beam, but the point is, it's a huge strategic blunder not to have the Constellation class, in my view. Huge strategic blunder. And I can't express my frustration enough, because you're literally just copying Italy's homework and Sweden's homework and just combining the Italian frigate from 8 or 10 years ago, and then putting a NASAMS missile on it, and maybe a modern American version of a radar system, and making it compliant with our stuff, and just putting it to sea, right? The technology transfer from another NATO power should not be difficult in any meaningful way. Like, we used to do this wonderfully, and now it doesn't seem to work out so well. And so really, it's very frustrating, because we used to have the Oliver Hazard Perry frigate class 12 years ago. They were decommissioned in their entirety, but now we don't have a replacement for that except the LCS, which is obviously, everybody knows, is garbage.
Do you think this is a political corruption story, or is there a Mahanian explanation for this incapacity?
Oh, I think there's a pretty clear Mahanian explanation, and the explanation is you don't have the industry to support the shipbuilding. You don't have the commerce to support it. And you know, I will believe that we are serious about shipbuilding when I hear stories of increasing coal production by 1,000% and a following 500 to 700% increase in steel production and aluminum production. Like, you have to have the resources and the production capacity upstream before you get the ships even built. Once you get the ships built, then you can actually man them with the sailors and set them to training and all of that stuff, which is a slightly separate question. But you got to have the resources to build the ships first. All right. Well, I think we can move on if you gentlemen would like. There is another. Let me see. There's another number. Yeah, there's another slight section here that I would like to go to. Let me see if I can find it. No, that's not the one. Go to page 225, please. This will be a section on the exception to the commerce rating and when it actually would work. Let me see.
All right.
Here. Right. Let me see. I think it's actually on page 230. Let me scroll through here 1 second. No, that's not it. Apologies.
No worries.
He does say that commerce rating is very simple. It is not a technical challenge because you only outfit ships that overpower a merchant, and so it does not require investment. It favors weaker parts, exceedingly difficult. It requires a very large navy, and would only work if there is not another peer rival on the water. Because if there was a peer rival on the water, obviously you wouldn't be using the Navy ships to blockade the enemy's ports, but you would send them in pursuit of the enemy Navy.
By illustration of the low technological
It's
barrier
the notes
to
that I
commerce
have.
rating, the low technological barrier to commerce rating is the example of the German raider Seeadler during the First World War. The Seeadler was a clipper ship, a sailing vessel that the Germans put a couple of cannons on and sent all around the world, seizing British merchant ships.
Yes. Well, unfortunately, I think that this section is not really illustrative of the point I was trying to make here, but yeah, that's unfortunate. Okay. In any case, the point I wanted to make with commerce rating, and this is especially true in the case of Iran, is you don't, if you have the geographical position, right, if you have the leverage, you're not, you're not going to be able to successfully blockade somebody who has effective control of a natural strait, right? If they have the ability to contest that strait with any sort of military assets, and especially air assets, this is just a general theory of warfare, right? You have to be able to advance your infantry into an area for you to consider it to be fully captured, right? You can't send a tank in an area. You can't send an aircraft to fly over an area. That's not what capture means, obviously. So given my historical analogy with infantry being surface vessels, you have to be able to effectively sail your surface vessels without any threat of harm in an area. And I'm not sure that that has necessarily been accomplished in the Strait of Hormuz. And
a contemporary example.
Indeed. And if it has, it's probably because there has not really been a serious contestation. And why that is, I don't know, other than maybe because there's been a truce or something when they've done it. But in any case, that is something that is going to be the one exception to the Mahanian rule of commerce rating. Is commerce rating can be effective to win a war, but you have to control a strait, is my interpretation of what he says.
All right. Do we have any other...
This is an aspect of...
Go ahead, Mr. Bagby.
Sorry. This does correspond to one of his major points about the attributes of successful naval strategy, physical geography, which he makes a definite point on. In the first part of his book, he outlines the true objectives of successful naval strategy. And he mentions depots of supply, communications of lines of communications to the base for operations, the military value of commerce rating, which we've discussed, but also a system of control on strategic choke points, which he takes some interest in as far as the geography of the globe. If you have the control of your enemy's choke points of trade, this is a strategic success. And
yes,
this
correct.
is something intractable. It's intractable in relation to Iran. Because of the geographical situation of Iran, they will always have a essential advantage over the Strait of Hormuz.
Indeed, it is a mountain fortress sitting on a naval choke point. It is a formidable problem for any naval planner wanting to wrest control of it away from the natives.
Indeed.
It's not a floodplain. And Mahan mentions the strategic importance of New Orleans and the lower Mississippi Valley in several capacities, that this is both a great economic asset of the United States, the extensive network of inland waterways and the internal trade that facilitates. In the case of Iran, we're not talking about the lowlands below New Orleans for fortification, which is also a geographical quandary. There is really no way, there's no way that a former generation of defensive warfare could adequately defend the lower delta because the land is entirely flat. It's also extremely difficult to get around on. You can't maneuver troops down there. It's only the banks of the river that are ever dry, the natural levees of the river before the modern constructions of levees. In the Strait of Hormuz, we're talking about a mountainous area. We're talking about giant rocky mountains, and these are excavated for infantry fortifications, for bunkers, for concealed missile emplacements. It is a extremely strong natural position, and coastal fortifications of this sort are extremely difficult to flank, to capture, to neutralize. it is a very, very difficult position, and it is a strategic natural advantage.
Yes, Mahan makes the point that an accessible coastline brings many advantages to a would-be sea power, but it brings equal vulnerabilities. What you can get into easily, your enemy can get into easily. We possess great natural advantages in that way, and we possess great natural vulnerabilities. Iran enjoys none of those natural advantages, but concurrently suffers none of those vulnerabilities.
Yes, this is.
It's a very strong target.
Mm.
Yes. Mahan also. Oh, go right ahead.
By all means, Mr. Bagby.
I lost my thought. Go ahead.
We've all lost our thoughts. You, me, and Mandrill all.
We're just
All right.
overwhelmed with pure theory here.
Lest we embarrass ourselves further, is there any more substance you want to cover, Mandrill, before we sum up?
Yes, actually, I think we should have a brief discourse on the characters of the people. I think that is probably something that we should cover. This geography and the boundaries of a nation's coastline are pretty simple for any person who has played any sort of strategic game. And of course, number of population, logistics, and that sort of thing is easy to understand. But the character and the national character is something that would be of great interest to us, I think. So if we could go to page 50, that
50
would be
coming
excellent.
up.
And pretty much he agrees with us totally in what we were saying earlier. And I can think of no better illustratory point than to say his paragraph here. All men seek gain and more or less love money, but the way in which gain is sought will have a marked effect upon the commercial fortunes and the history of the people inhabiting a country. If history may be believed, the way in which the Spaniards and their kindred nation, the Portuguese, sought wealth not only brought a blot upon the national character, but was also fatal to the growth of a healthy commerce, and so to the industries upon which commerce lives, and ultimately to that national wealth which was sought by mistaken paths. The desire for gain rose in them to fierce avarice. So they sought in the newfound worlds, which gave such an impetus to the commercial and maritime development of the countries of Europe, not new fields of industry, not even the healthy excitement of exploration and adventure, but gold and silver. They had many great qualities. They were bold, enterprising, temperate, patient of suffering, enthusiastic, and gifted with intense national feeling. When to these qualities are added the advantages of Spain's position and well-situated ports, the fact that she was first to occupy large and rich portions of the New Worlds and long remained without a competitor, and that for 100 years after the discovery of America, she was the leading state in Europe, she might have been expected to take the foremost place among the sea powers. Exactly the contrary was the result, as all know. Since the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, though engaged in many wars, no sea victory of any consequence shines on the pages of Spanish history, and the decay of her commerce sufficiently accounts for the painful and sometimes ludicrous inaptness shown on the decks of her ships of war. Doubtless, such a result is not to be attributed to one cause only. Doubtless, the government of Spain was in many ways such as to cramp and blight a free and healthy development of private enterprise, but the character of a great people breaks through or shapes the character of its government, and it can hardly be doubted that the bent of the people been toward trade, the action of government would have been drawn into the same current. The great field of the colonies, also, was remote from the center of that despotism which blighted the growth of old Spain. As it was, thousands of Spaniards, of the working as well as the upper classes, left Spain, and the occupations in which they engaged abroad sent home little but specie, or merchandise of small bulk, requiring but small tonnage. The mother country herself produced little but wool, fruit, and iron. Her manufactures were not. Her industries suffered. Her population steadily decreased. Both she and her colonies depended upon the Dutch for so many of the necessaries of life that the products of their scanty industries could not suffice to pay for them. So that Holland merchants, writes a contemporary, who carry money to most parts of the world to buy commodities, must out of this single country of Europe carry home money, which they receive in payment of their goods. Thus, their eagerly sought emblem of wealth passed quickly from their hands. It has already been pointed out how weak from a military point of view Spain was from this decay of her shipping. Her wealth being in small bulk on a few ships, following more or less regular routes, was easily seized by an enemy, and the sinews of war paralyzed, whereas the wealth of England and Holland, scattered over thousands of ships in all parts of the world, received many bitter blows in many exhausting wars, without checking a growth which, though painful, was steady. The fortunes of Portugal, united to Spain during a most critical period of her history, followed the same downward path. Although foremost in the beginning of the race for development by sea, she fell utterly behind. The mines of Brazil were the ruins of Portugal, as those of Mexico and Peru had been of Spain. All manufacturers fell into insane contempt. Ere long, the English supplied the Portuguese not only with clothes, but with all merchandise, all commodities, even to salt fish and grain. After their gold, the Portuguese abandoned their very soil. The vineyards of Oporto were finally bought by the English with Brazilian gold, which had only passed through Portugal to be spread throughout England. We are assured that in 50 years, $500 million were extracted from the mines of Brazil, and that at the end of the time, Portugal had but 25 millions in specie, a striking example of the difference between real and fictional wealth. Now, this
I can personally attest, as can anyone who's ever been in a Spanish church, that every surface seems to be covered in gold. The amount of bullion that was coming in during this period must have been staggering, because every Spanish church I saw while I was in Spain just decked out in gold. And it's illustrative, this point that Mahan makes between real and fictitious wealth. Mr. Bagby, you'll remember our discussion a few episodes back of the fundamental infertility of money and the problem with interest. We see this illustrated on a historic scale with Spain and Portugal. They were drowning in gold, and yet it gave rise to no fruits other than admittedly beautiful churches.
They became overly reliant on money to solve their problems and neglected industry, neglected the production of the necessities of good living. And this is a parable that we often use in relation to the decline of the Western Empire. The Romans expected they'd be able to buy their way out of troubles. They started relying on mercenaries and bribes to dissuade their enemies while they rested in luxury. And this is the story of the decline of Spain as well. This is a very apt parable.
Now we don't even trouble to mine the gold. We just digitize it into an existence.
Now, this is also very interesting to me as well from anybody who's had any time in the Austrian economic sphere and what Mises has to write about gold being the only real form of money. It's very fascinating because I think he would, in his own way, probably agree that real wealth is based in something that is tangible and not something that's fictitious or made up or on a spreadsheet somewhere. It's real in what you can hold in your hand, basically.
As correspondent to the Southern agrarian position, which is wealth is commodities, we value specie as a means to communicate that wealth efficiently from one transaction to another. But the Southern position was always that the true source of wealth comes out of the earth. It is the crops of the earth. It is the livestock. And these are natural productions. These are products of nature, ultimately.
But
and this is very different than the the means of wealth from commerce, which is in the duty of exchange, what is due to someone who transports a good from one place to another, or who retails the good from the wholesaler and marks up the profit, which is far more abstract. But in this case, this is literally bringing the gold and silver out of the mines, and the sort of havoc this wreaked on the national character of those that found themselves in possession of the literal gold mine. They could bring their wealth directly out of the earth, and this was the source of the decline of their national character. In a way, I'd say the modern finance is far more dangerous.
Oh yes, it is the same principle taken to unbelievable levels of efficiency.
Yeah, I also think that this is funny because he's basically giving a little bit of an ethnic shitpost here about the Spaniards and the Portuguese, and saying that they are very high time preference people. I was very highly entertained because that is a true fact check from Captain Mahan here. So
they have a strident national character.
They do indeed. I think the last thing I would like to touch on, there's another small section. It's less than a page about the English and Dutch, if you guys wouldn't mind it.
Certainly.
Okay. So the English, this is still on page 52.
Ah, okay.
So right there. Yeah. This will be a nice capstone to the stream. The English and Dutch were no less desirous of gain than the southern nations. Each in turn has been called a nation of shopkeepers. But the jeer, insofar as
wept.
But the jeer, insofar as it is just, is to the credit of their wisdom and uprightness. They were no less bold, no less enterprising, no less patient. Indeed, they were more patient, in that they sought riches not by the sword, but by labor, which is the reproach meant to be implied by the epithet. For thus they took the longest, instead of what seemed the shortest, road to wealth. But these two peoples, radically of the same race, had other qualities, no less important than those just named, which combined with their surroundings to favor their development by sea. They were by nature businessmen, traders, producers, negotiators. Therefore, both in their native country and abroad, whether settled in the ports of civilized nations or of barbarous Eastern rulers, or in the colonies of their own foundation, they everywhere strove to draw out all the resources of the land, to develop and increase them. The quick instinct of the born trader, shopkeeper if you will, sought continually new articles to exchange, and this search, combined with the industrious character evolved through generations of labor, made them necessarily producers. At home, they became great as manufacturers. Abroad, where they controlled, the land grew richer continually. Products multiplied, and the necessary exchange between home and the settlements called for more ships. Their shipping therefore increased with these demands of trade, and nations with less aptitude for maritime enterprise, even France herself, great as she has been, called for their products and for the service of their ships. Thus, in many ways, they advanced to power at sea. This natural tendency and growth were indeed modified and seriously checked at times by the interference of other governments, jealous of a prosperity which their own people could invade only by the aid of artificial support, a support which will be considered upon the head of governmental action as affecting sea power. So just a really interesting comparison between the character of the northern peoples and the more Iberian type, I suppose.
Always good to get your shots in.
It's certainly a stable construction, and we could point to the success of the United States and the commercial success of the British Empire as excellent examples of that. It's a compelling argument.
It is. All right, Mr. Mandrill, do you have any closing thoughts for us before we move on to Super Chats?
Yeah, I do. I just would like to say that I can only recommend Mahan so much, I suppose, but he's a thinker that everybody should read. He's actually, if you're interested in history and if you have any interest in military or naval affairs, I can't recommend him highly enough. And like there's one other section on the national governments, which I found very fascinating, which I think that's the other, I mentioned this before, I think, but he's rather even-handed with national governments. He has a tendency to praise where it's required and chide where it's necessary and that sort of thing. So I find that was probably also of great interest as well. His historical comparisons are probably the best part. Like I really enjoy how he talks about the era of history that he really focuses on, which is the centuries, the 2 or 3 centuries that precede his own.
Indeed, the War of Spanish Succession mentioned. All right, Mr. Bagby, any closing thoughts on Alfred Thayer Mahan?
It's a fascinating book. It's been a pleasure to get into him today. He was extremely influential, and this is what the military was studying at the time of the Spanish-American War. And famously, Theodore Roosevelt was very interested in this book, and this is part of the reason for the great expansion of the United States fleet after the Spanish War and the projection of American naval power abroad, which follows in South America and Central America immediately following the Spanish War. So its influence on that period of history is noted by all the historians of the period, and this is tribute to its excellence and its landmark status. But we can also see how his insights it gives us greater wisdom about our own circumstances and about our own challenges today.
Indeed. I look forward to the next installment from Tallman Books, The Influence
Valuable contribution.
The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. All right, we will get on to some super chats. Bolero 393 for $4.99 sends us, full steam ahead, gentlemen. Full steam ahead to you too, sir. Thank you for the super chat. X-Runner 55 sends $5 even. Monitor by James Decay describes the design ideas of ironclads in the North and the South to lead to the first battle. I assume he means the Battle of Hampton Roads, but Mr. Bagby, are you familiar with Monitor by James Decay?
I am. That sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah. All right. X-Runner 55 sends us another $5 to say, I met the lead system engineers of the LCS, all women. That's very reassuring.
Well, that explains so much of why that class of ship has the ills and woes that it does.
You want to give the chat a brief rundown on the littoral combat ship?
Sure. Well, in addition to creating 2 ships of the same class, or 2 different classes of the same type of ship, you had an experimental propulsion plant. I'm starting from the baseline ground level and working my way up, so you get a picture of how bad it is. You have an experimental propulsion plant that you didn't op test in laboratory conditions to see if it was even feasible. So you have constant breakdowns, which limit its total speed, which its big claim to fame is that it was fast, right? Ooh, it's so fast, and we have this electronic fancy thing that means that we can scale down and run quiet with electronics and all of this stuff. And anyway, it's a huge overcomplication in engineering terms. Now, after that, you have the fact that it is a aluminum hulled warship, which should immediately set your alarm bells off because aluminum has a much lower melting point than steel does. So if you have a shipboard fire, it is conceivable with a class Bravo or even a class Delta fire, which those are fuel and metal fires, basically, like manganese and all of that stuff, which is found commonly in munitions. If you have those two classes of fire, well, guess what? Your ship hull is going to melt. So that's not good. That's the second thing. And number three, it was initially not designed with a anti-ship cruise missile on it. So you have a warship that is supposed to be a littoral ship, a basically modern frigate that cannot engage other warships of equal or superior class in weight terms.
All right. Well, I believe that's all the super chats. Thank you very much, Mandrill, for sharing your specific naval knowledge with us today. And thank you, Mr. Bagby, as always, for the historical color. You have anything to shill, Mandrill?
Yes. I just recently, as of yesterday, I should say, brought an article on my Substack out from behind the paywall. It's on Substack. Go look it up. It is my the 4-stroke progressive engine that could. It's my great chronology analysis and my own take on the fourth turning, basically. So if that's of interest to you, if chronological systems or any sort of generational turnover interests you, do go check that out. I go into some pretty in-depth historical stuff about various events and my own conception of them. So not one of my main articles, not one that I'm known for, but it's probably one I put a lot of time and effort into. So do go check that out because it's free.
Excellent. Yes, everyone check out Raging Mandrill's Substack, which is entitled
Intellectual Primate.
Intellectual Primate. Mr. Bagby, what fresh delights are you offering the public this week?
I have several things that are about to come online. I have a biography of John Taylor of Caroline and another of Sam Houston. I've got Marquis James's biography of Sam Houston from 1929. That's all ready. I'm just waiting to finish the upload. So that should all be coming online soon. I have new series of biographies on the way.
And where might a man of
But check
middling
out-
height find such a thing?
You find that at www.tallmenbooks.com, which is where you can find all my work.
Splendid. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Thank you, chat. And with that, we will